The early years of the Second World War presented a false sense of security to millions of German citizens. People went to work and returned home with a degree of normalcy despite the distant sound of battle lines being drawn across Europe. Life in the major industrial centers of the Reich continued with only minor inconveniences and the omnipresent but abstract threat of war. The Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, had demonstrated a devastating capacity for precision bombing against cities like Rotterdam and London. This success, however, led German authorities to believe their own defenses and air superiority were virtually impenetrable against any reciprocal attack. Propaganda posters and radio broadcasts constantly reinforced the message that the Reich was protected and the Fuhrer was watching over them. Children still played in the streets, and couples still strolled in the parks during the evening hours, mostly unconcerned about the aerial threat. The vast majority of aerial attacks that did occur were often limited in scope and were easily dismissed as pinpricks or the result of poor British aim. Night was particularly regarded as a sanctuary, a time when the darkness itself offered a cloak of protection against high-altitude bombers. This belief was rooted in the early reality of the war, where rudimentary navigation systems severely hampered the Royal Air Force's ability to locate specific targets after sunset. Early RAF raids often missed their designated military or industrial complexes, with bombs falling instead into open fields or harmlessly scattered across the periphery of a city. The German civilian population felt secure knowing that hitting a small factory or railway yard in the dark was an astronomically difficult task for the enemy. Air raid sirens occasionally wailed, but these alerts frequently proved to be false alarms or involved minimal damage far from residential areas, further breeding complacency. This widespread confidence in German air defenses and the perceived incompetence of the British nighttime bombing efforts created a dangerous, collective psychological shield. The initial response to the declaration of war had been fear, but this fear had slowly calcified into a kind of determined, but ultimately fragile, sense of invulnerability. They believed the war would be won quickly and that the terror of the Blitz would never be turned back against the homeland in any meaningful or consistent way. Even the implementation of the Verdunkelung, the mandatory blackout regulations, was viewed more as a civic duty than as a necessary and urgent measure of survival. The daily news cycle focused on German victories in the East and West, effectively minimizing any acknowledgement of the slow, methodical planning occurring across the English Channel. This initial calm and the misplaced faith in their technological advantage would prove to be a tragic and fatal miscalculation in the unfolding drama of the air war. The very darkness that seemed to offer safety was soon to become the terrifying blanket under which unimaginable destruction would be delivered. The security of the German night was an illusion, a beautiful but fleeting moment before the strategic and technological reality of total war was fully unleashed. The initial RAF bombing efforts during the first years of the war were marred by a series of failures, organizational issues, and technological limitations. The British strategic plan was ambitious, aiming to cripple German industry and military production through focused, high-precision attacks. The reality, however, was that the bombers of the time were largely incapable of executing this vision with any consistent accuracy, particularly during night raids. Crews would often take off under the cover of darkness, tasked with locating targets that were impossibly small to see from high altitude in the pitch black. The primary navigation method relied heavily on dead reckoning, a technique prone to enormous errors due to unpredictable winds, cloud cover, and general pilot fatigue. It was discovered that a staggering majority of bombs dropped during this period fell miles from their intended targets, often missing entire cities altogether. An analysis conducted by the British itself, known as the Butt Report of 1941, delivered a brutal and unforgiving assessment of the Bomber Command's operational effectiveness. The report revealed that only a small fraction of aircrews were able to drop their ordnance within 5 miles of the target, exposing the massive gulf between aspiration and reality. This technological incompetence and navigational crisis forced a profound and difficult reevaluation of the entire strategic bombing campaign. The original concept of hitting specific factories and military installations with surgical strikes was deemed fundamentally impossible with the tools at hand. The failure to hit designated targets was compounded by the severe losses of trained aircrews and expensive, hard-to-replace aircraft. Morale within the Bomber Command itself suffered as crews risked their lives on missions that seemed to yield almost no tangible results against the enemy. The political and military leadership in London faced increasing pressure to either abandon the night campaign or find a drastically different way to employ their air power. This moment of critical strategic reassessment became the crucible for a dramatic shift in policy and doctrine regarding the use of aerial bombardment. The focus shifted away from the impossible task of precise targeting towards a new, more feasible goal of massive, concentrated destruction across wide urban areas. This emerging strategy of area bombing acknowledged the limitations of technology while simultaneously embracing the controversial goal of dehousing and demoralizing the civilian population. The aim was no longer to find a specific factory chimney, but simply to locate a major metropolitan area and saturate it with explosives and incendiary devices. This meant accepting that the bombs would inevitably fall on homes, schools, hospitals, and churches, fundamentally altering the moral and legal landscape of the air war. The lessons learned from the early, costly, and largely unsuccessful raids laid the groundwork for a new, terrifyingly effective campaign that would change the course of the conflict. The military necessity and the desperation for a decisive blow against Germany ultimately overcame the ethical reservations about targeting noncombatants. The appointment of Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Harris to lead the Bomber Command in 1942 marked a decisive and brutal turning point in the strategic air war. Harris, an unflinching and formidable military figure, had an unshakable belief in the power of sustained, total aerial bombardment to break the will of the German nation. He became the most zealous and uncompromising proponent of the area bombing strategy, earning him the enduring and notorious nickname Bomber Harris. Harris was convinced that only the complete and utter destruction of Germany's major cities could force an end to the conflict and save Allied ground forces. He was entirely dismissive of the former attempts at precision bombing, viewing them as a costly distraction from the main, overwhelming task at hand. Under his command, the moral compass of the RAF definitively shifted from the targeted destruction of military capacity to the wholesale destruction of the enemy's social fabric. The new policy was rooted in the idea of dehousing, which posited that rendering millions of German workers homeless would severely impact war production and civilian morale. This approach was controversial even within the highest echelons of the British military and political establishment, but Harris was relentless in its implementation. He argued that since German industry was so closely integrated with its urban centers, the entire city effectively became a legitimate military target. The destruction of residential areas was not an unfortunate side effect, but rather a central and necessary component of the strategy under Harris's grim direction. He famously stated that the Nazis had sown the wind and that Britain would now ensure they reaped the whirlwind of total war and destruction. Harris oversaw a massive expansion and re-equipment of the Bomber Command, receiving new, four-engine heavy bombers like the Avro Lancaster, which carried larger payloads further. The strategic debates in London often centered on the efficiency and morality of this destructive policy, but the military imperative for success ultimately prevailed. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, while at times uneasy about the scale of destruction, ultimately supported Harris's efforts as a vital means of attacking the German mainland. The moral shift was cemented by the deep-seated British memory of the Blitz and the widespread desire for immediate and devastating retribution against Germany. The official directives given to Bomber Command were increasingly unambiguous, prioritizing the destruction of entire urban zones rather than individual facilities. Harris's singular focus and unyielding commitment transformed the RAF into a force dedicated to a campaign of strategic, systemic terror from the skies. His unwavering belief that area bombing was the shortest route to victory led to a campaign of unparalleled and deliberate civilian destruction in the history of aerial warfare. The commander's legacy remains one of the most debated and difficult aspects of the war, a stark reminder of the ethical compromises made in the name of total victory. The fundamental shift from the aspiration of precision bombing to the calculated reality of area bombing was driven by both technological failure and strategic necessity. Precision bombing had failed because the navigation tools of the early 1940s simply could not ensure accuracy over long distances, especially at night and under heavy cloud cover. The average margin of error for a single bomber on a clear night was measured in miles, making the targeted destruction of a small factory an impossible dream. Area bombing, by contrast, simplified the task dramatically by defining success not by hitting a pinprick target, but by saturating a designated square mile of a major city. The change in strategy dictated a change in the type of ordnance used in the mass raids on Germany. High explosive bombs were still necessary to demolish structures and flatten buildings, but they were now paired with an enormous quantity of incendiary devices. The goal was to create uncontrollable, massive fires that would spread rapidly through the densely packed, timber-framed buildings of German city centers. The new emphasis on widespread destruction required a new philosophy for how the raids were actually executed across the target zone. Crews were no longer given complex, individualized military objectives, but were instead directed to concentrate their attack within a designated target zone. This zone was often the older, more residential core of a city, which was known to contain highly combustible medieval architecture and dense populations. The raids were carefully planned to be delivered in a concentrated wave, ensuring that the initial wave of bombs overwhelmed the local firefighting and emergency services. The heavy concentration of bombs in a short period of time maximized the chance of fires merging to create the terrifying and unstoppable phenomenon of the firestorm. This transition was a formal military acknowledgement that attacking the German civilian infrastructure and morale was a more achievable and effective military goal than destroying individual industrial sites. It represented a grim and calculated decision to embrace mass destruction as a form of strategic warfare against a desperate enemy. The British military planners rationalized the policy by arguing that every component of the German war machine, including the homes of its workers, contributed to the war effort. The policy was an inherently destructive one, but it was viewed as the only means available to the British to directly strike at the heart of the Third Reich before a full-scale invasion could be mounted. This calculated shift from surgical strikes to carpet bombing ensured that the nightly air raids would become a systematic campaign of terror and urban obliteration. The strategic adjustment finally gave the massive bomber fleets of the RAF a military purpose that their current technology could actually achieve with brutal efficiency. The firestorm was the terrifying and inevitable outcome when the new strategy of area bombing was perfectly executed against the susceptible conditions of a dense city. A firestorm is not simply a large fire, but a meteorological phenomenon where multiple, widespread fires merge to create a single, enormous inferno. The intense heat generated by this merged blaze draws in massive quantities of air from the surrounding environment at hurricane-force speeds. This inward rush of air feeds the flames with a constant supply of oxygen, ensuring the combustion is absolute and the temperatures are impossibly high. The classic example of this terrifying effect was the devastating Operation Gamara against the city of Hamburg in late July and early August of 1943. Wave after wave of RAF and American bombers struck the city over a period of 10 days and nights, saturating it with high explosives and incendiaries. The combination of dry summer weather, dense housing, and the failure of the city's water supply created the perfect conditions for the ultimate catastrophe. On the night of July 27th, the fires coalesced into a colossal firestorm, an unprecedented event that consumed everything in its path. Temperatures at the core of the firestorm were estimated to have reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius, enough to melt asphalt and vaporize human remains. The tremendous suction created by the heat pulled people, furniture, and debris into the churning heart of the inferno, eliminating all chance of escape. Survivors described the sound as a continuous, terrifying roar, and the sight as a column of fire that reached thousands of feet into the night sky. People seeking shelter in basements were often asphyxiated as the fire consumed all the oxygen or were literally cooked alive by the penetrating, overwhelming heat. The destruction was so complete that entire districts of Hamburg were reduced to a flat, featureless wasteland of ash and rubble overnight. The firestorm demonstrated the full, horrific potential of the area bombing campaign when all variables aligned for maximum destruction. It proved that the sheer volume and concentration of bombs, delivered with precision navigation, could completely overwhelm the defenses and infrastructure of a modern city. The experience of Hamburg became a sobering lesson for both the Allies and the Germans about the horrific new dimension of warfare introduced by mass aerial assault. The subsequent planning of RAF raids incorporated the goal of firestorm creation as a deliberate, tactical objective for the most important German targets. The firestorm was the ultimate, devastating consequence of the moral and strategic shift that Harris had championed, bringing total war directly to the German home front. The successful execution of area bombing was directly dependent on solving the previously insurmountable problem of nighttime navigation. The technological solution came in the form of a suite of electronic navigation aids that allowed bomber command to accurately locate targets regardless of visibility. One of the earliest and most critical systems was G, which used synchronized radio pulses transmitted from 3 ground stations in England to pinpoint an aircraft's location. G allowed navigators to determine their position with unprecedented accuracy, enabling the bomber stream to maintain formation and arrive over the target area en masse. However, G's range was limited, and the system was eventually jammed by the Germans as the war progressed, forcing the development of new, more advanced technologies. The next significant leap was the introduction of oboe, a highly precise system that used 2 ground stations to control a single aircraft, guiding it exactly over the target. Oboe was accurate enough for genuine precision bombing, but its capacity was limited to only 1 aircraft at a time, making it most valuable for the specialized Pathfinder crews. The most transformative and enduring navigational aid was the H-2S radar system, which was entirely self-contained within the aircraft itself. H-2S displayed a recognizable, albeit crude, radar map of the ground below, revealing coastlines, large bodies of water, and the built-up areas of cities. The ability to see the ground through clouds or darkness was revolutionary, providing the crews with a reliable, visual confirmation of their position over the continent. This onboard radar was critical for the later mass raids deep into Germany, where the signal from the British-based oboe system could not reach. These new technologies were carefully introduced and constantly upgraded in a desperate, ongoing electronic battle against German countermeasures. The development of these aids transformed the role of the navigator from a hopeful guesser to a highly skilled operator of complex electronic equipment. The combination of G, oboe, and H-2S allowed the RAF to finally concentrate its forces effectively, dropping their payloads on the intended urban centers rather than scattering them across the countryside. The solution to the navigational puzzle eliminated the fundamental excuse for the early failures of the bombing campaign, paving the way for the devastating effectiveness of the later years. The ability to consistently and accurately deliver massed firepower to a small, concentrated area was the technical secret behind the area bombing strategies' shocking lethality. The British technological edge in this field was maintained for long periods, giving the RAF a crucial, though temporary, advantage in the war over Germany. The introduction of the Pathfinder Force in 1942 was a tactical innovation that bridged the gap between the new navigational technology and the massed bomber stream. The Pathfinders were a hand-picked, elite group of the most experienced and skilled aircrews from across the Bomber Command. Their mission was not to drop general ordnance, but to fly ahead of the main force and accurately mark the designated target zone for the bombers that followed. They utilized the most advanced navigation tools, particularly the oboe system, to fly directly over the target with almost perfect precision. Once over the target, the Pathfinders would drop a series of bright, highly visible pyrotechnic markers, known as target indicators or TIs, in specific coded colors. These markers, often deployed with a delay fuse, created a blazing, colorful bullseye on the ground that the subsequent bombers could aim for with their main load. The Pathfinders were effectively the eyes of the Bomber Command, relying on their expertise to ensure the entire destructive effort was concentrated in the desired area. The main bomber stream, consisting of hundreds of aircraft, did not need to rely on their own individual, less reliable navigation systems or struggle to identify the city in the darkness. They simply had to aim for the center of the illuminated cluster of colored marker flares, greatly reducing the scattering of bombs. The accuracy of the overall raid was now dependent on the skill of a relatively small group of specialized crews rather than the average competence of all crews. The German defenders quickly learned to fear the appearance of the Pathfinder flares, understanding that the massed attack would follow within minutes. The Germans attempted to replicate the Pathfinder markers with their own decoy flares, forcing the British to constantly change the colors and timing of the target indicators. This tactical innovation provided the critical last mile of accuracy that the area bombing strategy desperately required to be consistently effective. The Pathfinder concept ensured the necessary concentration of force to overwhelm German defenses and local emergency services in a short period of time. It was a perilous assignment, as the Pathfinders were the first aircraft over the target and often had to circle to verify their markings, enduring the heaviest initial flak barrage. The Pathfinder's success in lighting the way was directly proportional to the subsequent destruction caused by the main bomber force in the minutes that followed. This relatively simple tactical adjustment unlocked the full, devastating potential of the new heavy bomber fleet and the area bombing campaign. The deliberate targeting of German cities was intended to serve a military purpose by destroying infrastructure, but it was also a potent weapon of psychological warfare. The campaign was designed to systematically break the morale of the German population and undermine their faith in the Nazi leadership. The nightly, continuous raids ensured that no citizen, no matter how distant from the front lines, felt safe or secure from the terror of the war. The primary psychological goal was dehousing, the creation of a vast, internal refugee crisis by rendering millions of people homeless. It was reasoned that men and women forced to spend their nights in air raid shelters or fleeing from burning cities could not report to work in the morning. This continuous disruption of sleep, routine, and domestic stability was intended to erode the German will to support and sustain the war effort. The propaganda machine of the RAF, though less visible than the bombs themselves, was also carefully tuned to maximize the fear and uncertainty. Leaflets were dropped over cities, detailing the destruction already wrought and promising further, even greater raids in the nights to come. The German response to this psychological onslaught was complex, involving a mixture of fierce resentment, stoic endurance, and, eventually, profound war weariness. The Nazi Party attempted to maintain morale through relentless counterpropaganda, downplaying the scale of the destruction and emphasizing German victories elsewhere. However, the sight of entire blocks of residential buildings reduced to smoldering rubble was an immediate, visceral refutation of the state's claims of invincibility. The psychological toll was immense, leading to widespread cases of shell shock, chronic exhaustion, and a sense of deep, pervasive hopelessness among the civilians. The raids forced a mass evacuation of children and non-essential personnel from major cities, which further disrupted the social and economic order of the Reich. While the campaign did not lead to a spontaneous collapse of German morale, as some of its advocates had hoped, it certainly contributed to a slow, grinding erosion of support. The constant threat from the air shifted the civilian focus from winning the war to merely surviving the next night's attack. The area bombing campaign turned the cities into a second, terrifying front line, ensuring that every German citizen was made a direct participant and victim of the total war. While the primary focus of area bombing was the urban core, the campaign achieved a secondary, devastating effect on Germany's industrial capacity. The strategic planners understood that a significant portion of the armaments industry, particularly smaller, specialized workshops and supply chains, was embedded within the cities. The widespread destruction of residential areas inevitably destroyed the infrastructure supporting the key workers who kept the vital factories running. Transportation networks, including railway marshalling yards, local ports, and road systems, were systematically pulverized by the massed air raids. The obliteration of utility services, such as water, gas, and electricity, brought entire industrial districts to a standstill, even if the factory buildings themselves survived. The German economic miracle, which had successfully mobilized the country for total war, was highly dependent on the interconnectedness of its urban centers. The loss of worker housing and local services in cities like Cologne, Essen, and Dusseldorf made it nearly impossible to maintain a full, productive workforce. Targeted campaigns, such as the infamous Battle of the Ruhr, specifically focused on the industrial heartland of Germany, home to its crucial coal, steel, and armaments production. The systematic attack on oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants was particularly damaging, crippling the German military's ability to wage mechanized warfare. By destroying the cities that fed the factories, the RAF found an indirect, but highly effective, way to sabotage the entire German war economy. The continuous nature of the bombing forced the Germans to divert an enormous amount of resources, manpower, and production to defense and repair efforts. Tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of thousands of personnel were tied up in defending the homeland against the bomber command, diverting them from the eastern and western fronts. This forced reallocation of resources was, in itself, a significant strategic success for the Allied air campaign, regardless of the direct damage to any single factory. The air offensive created an environment where industrial production was constantly threatened, disrupted, and forced into costly, decentralized locations. The combination of area bombing and later precision attacks against specific bottlenecks eventually created an unsustainable pressure on the entire German industrial base. The campaign may not have single-handedly defeated the German war machine, but it relentlessly eroded the nation's capacity to continue fighting a total global war. The escalation of the RAF's bombing campaign forced the German High Command into a desperate and escalating scramble to defend the Reich's airspace. The creation of the Jagd, the German night fighter force, was the most direct and effective response to the British aerial threat over the homeland. These night fighters, often equipped with sophisticated radar like Liechtenstein, became increasingly deadly hunters in the darkness, specializing in ambush attacks on the bomber stream. The introduction of specialized techniques, such as the wild boar and tame boar operations, allowed German fighters to engage the British bombers with varying levels of radar and ground control support. German cities were fortified with an ever-increasing concentration of anti-aircraft artillery, known as flak, which created a terrifying and lethal curtain of fire. The presence of heavy flak batteries forced the RAF bombers to fly at higher altitudes, which, in turn, slightly reduced the accuracy of the bomb drops. Vast, reinforced concrete bunkers and towers, the flak term, were constructed in key cities to serve as both anti-aircraft platforms and public air raid shelters. The Germans also engaged in an intense electronic warfare battle, quickly deploying countermeasures against the new British navigation aids like GPS and oboe. The development of their own jamming signals and the sophisticated use of false electronic beacons created chaos and confusion within the RAF's bomber streams on numerous occasions. German intelligence meticulously studied the British bombing patterns, attempting to anticipate the next target and concentrate their defenses accordingly. They quickly began to employ decoy sites, known as Stadttarnungen, which were elaborate mock-ups of industrial areas created away from the real targets to draw off the bomb loads. Despite these significant defensive efforts and the ingenuity of their scientists and engineers, the German response was always reactive, struggling to keep pace with the pace of Allied innovation. The continuous necessity of defending the homeland drained crucial resources and fighter aircraft from the critical front lines where they were desperately needed. The massive commitment of manpower to anti-aircraft duties also diverted hundreds of thousands of soldiers who could have been fighting the advancing Soviet or Western Allied armies. Ultimately, while the German defenses inflicted grievous losses on the bomber command, they failed to stop the systematic destruction of their cities and industrial capacity. The strategic decision to focus on offense meant that the German Air Force was never adequately equipped or numerous enough to completely neutralize the relentless threat of the nightly raids. The area bombing campaign inflicted a staggering and unprecedented human cost on the German civilian population. The final death toll is estimated to be well over 500,000 people, with countless others suffering lifelong injuries, both physical and psychological. Entire families were wiped out in a single night as high explosive bombs detonated or firestorms consumed their homes and shelters. The trauma of being buried under rubble, witnessing the death of loved ones, and fleeing relentless infernos left indelible scars on the survivors. The constant state of fear and anxiety during the air raids shattered the sense of security and trust in the predictable rhythms of daily life. The displacement of millions from their homes created a vast humanitarian crisis, as refugees were forced to seek shelter and sustenance in the less damaged towns and countryside. Many survivors carried the psychological burden of having lost all their possessions, their memories, and the physical places that had defined their lives. The most vulnerable populations, the elderly, the sick, and young children, were disproportionately affected by the stresses and deprivations of the bombing. Emergency services, including medical personnel, firefighters, and police, worked tirelessly and heroically under impossible conditions to pull survivors from the wreckage. The infrastructure of social support, including hospitals, schools, and civic organizations, was systematically degraded and destroyed, making recovery nearly impossible. The physical act of clearing the rubble, the Trümmerbeseitigung, became a grim and monumental task that occupied German cities for years after the war had ended. Women, known as the Trümmerfrauen or rubble women, played a crucial role in manually dismantling the ruins brick by brick, symbolizing the resilience and the hardship of the post-war era. The indiscriminate nature of the bombing meant that the casualties were drawn from every social class, every profession, and every age group. There was no escaping the reality that, for the first time on this scale, the entire civilian population of a nation was deliberately placed on the front line of a total war. The experience of the bombing became a defining, collective memory for an entire generation of Germans, shaping their post-war attitudes towards conflict and violence. The sheer scale of the human loss stands as a grim testament to the devastating power of industrialized aerial warfare when applied without restraint to urban centers. The legacy of the area bombing campaign against German cities remains one of the most complex, contested, and morally difficult chapters of World War II. Militarily, its effectiveness is still hotly debated by historians who argue over whether the destruction fundamentally shortened the war or merely diverted resources. Critics maintain that the enormous human cost was not justified by the tangible, measurable disruption to the German war machine, which proved surprisingly resilient. The policy undoubtedly created a significant second front in the air, forcing the diversion of valuable resources to defense and hindering German offensive operations. The campaign established a grim precedent for the use of air power, where the distinction between combatant and non-combatant was systematically and deliberately blurred. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945, in particular, remains an enduring and controversial symbol of the campaign's ethical boundaries and devastating power. The post-war reconstruction of Germany was profoundly shaped by the massive physical damage, necessitating a complete modernization and redesign of many major cities. Many historical city centers, irreplaceable architectural treasures, were permanently lost, replaced by modern, less dense, and more functional urban planning. The experience influenced international law and the conventions of war, contributing to the development of legal frameworks aimed at protecting civilians in future conflicts. In Britain, the war-era resolve and justification gave way over time to a more nuanced and often critical public assessment of the necessity and morality of the campaign. The figure of Sir Arthur Harris remains a deeply polarizing one, celebrated by some for his single-minded dedication to victory and condemned by others as a war criminal. For the surviving Germans, the memory of the nightly terror and the unimaginable destruction is a permanent reminder of the ultimate price of a dictatorial regime and total war. The numerous memorials and museums throughout the reconstructed cities now serve as solemn places of remembrance, honoring both the victims and the difficult history of the conflict. The story of the area bombing campaign is a stark historical document detailing how desperation and technological progress can combine to change the very nature of conflict. It serves as a perpetual warning about the immense moral challenges that arise when military goals are pursued with an unwavering, destructive focus on an entire nation. The initial feeling of safety in the German night was extinguished forever, replaced by a lasting and shared trauma that transcends national boundaries and continues to inform our understanding of modern warfare.